Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It may seem rather strange to begin with two dates that seem to have no relationship whatsoever to Andreas Vesalius, particularly when 2014 was the 500th anniversary of his birth and the 450th anniversary of his death. But paradoxically, the major discoveries fell outside that year, and I'm going to tell you about them this afternoon. They fall into three groups. Some of them are discoveries by librarians. Here, for instance, is the wonderful presentation copy of his famous book, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, of 1543. Almost certainly the presentation copy to the Emperor Charles V, and now, I believe, in the New York Public Library. And there's a similar copy of the Epitome in Cambridge University Library. But I want to talk in about three sections of Vesalius. The first is all this new information about his life and family. Secondly, about the development of his anatomical ideas. And thirdly, and very briefly, all the new information about the reception of the Fabrica, which contradicts almost everything that we thought we knew. So what about Vesalius's life? Well, here, the people who have been responsible are three local physicians, or three Belgian surgeons, Moritz Briesbroek, Theo Goderis, Omar Steno, who run also a major website devoted to Andreas Vesalius, who is, of course, one of the famous Belgians. I think he comes number 2 in the list beyond Eddy Merckx. And this group of amateur historians, though they know far more about Vesalius than almost anybody else on this planet, have been unearthing unpublished letters and documents, which they found just by going to archives, asking, reading books that nobody had ever read. And indeed, they unearthed a forgotten letter of Vesalius, which was published only a few weeks ago. And it's 28 pages long and deals with the case of a man with a urological problem. And Vesalius provides his instructions for the man's carers, as well as writing a small tract on how to deal surgically with urological problems. And this Belgian trio, which were called the Belgian Cerberus by a friend of theirs, because they like the three-headed dog that guards the entrance to the underworld, and they know more about the dead Vesalius than anybody else. And they first of all discovered more about Vesalius's relationship to artists. They shown how he was brought up in Brussels along with artists. And he probably did know Jan van Kalkar, who was the illustrator of these 6 anatomical plates. Kalkar is said to have paid for the publication. And they've argued that he drew some of the plates for the Fabrica, including this very recently discovered preliminary sketch of one of the most famous of all illustrations in the Fabrica. And they've also shown that there were other artists involved, but not significantly Titian, That was a misreading and a misunderstanding of an Italian text. They've also shown something that we've forgotten. This is Vesalius' life as a courtier. Now, we know from at least two 16th century letter writers what the qualifications for being a court doctor were. The first was stamina, the ability to spend your time doing nothing and being unable to even to blow your nose in public. But above all, courtesy, courtly behavior. Did you know what it was like to be a doctor to a monarch? And finally, general ability, but the first two were far more important. Vesalius' father, remember, is an imperial apothecary. And we now know his brother-in-law is in court service as a barber. And I think it's his wife, Anna Vesalius, who's being paid in a job that seems to have something to do with attending to the imperial teeth. Vesalius is a courtier, brought up as a courtier. And my Belgian friends have also demolished the famous legend that he died back on the Greek island of Zante while on his way from Jerusalem as part of a penance for accidentally dissecting a body that was still alive. And quite soon after his death, rumors began to circulate about Vesalius the vivisector. There were other, perhaps better founded rumors that he was planning in 1564-65 to return to Padua to succeed Falloppia as professor. But we now know that he was sent as guardian of an annual payment by the King of Spain for the upkeep of Christian churches in the Holy Land. And every year, one courtier took the money. And we have the letter of permission from King Philip of Spain, and who clearly expects Vesalius to return to his service. But this legend shows the concern of non-medics about anatomy. What can happen? Who is dissecting these bodies? And we must always remember that anatomy and dissection have a certain taint of dirtiness about them. Secondly, what have we learned new about Vesalius as an anatomist and as a thinker? And here I confess I'm going to blow my own trumpet very loudly, because in December 2009, I was offered the opportunity to edit the notes by Vesalius to the second edition of his Fabrica. And I published them in the journal Medical History in 2012. And in 2014, as part of the great quincentenary celebrations, the firm of Praga in Basel published a massive English translation, not only of the 1543 Fabrica, but also of the 1555 Fabrica, all the new changes there, and many of the new notes that I had discovered. How did I find them? Well, I knew they existed because they appeared at auction in about 2007. It was an exhibition in Toronto. The owner of the copy of the Principles of Anatomy, according to Galen, allowed his copy to be put on display. And I saw it in Toronto. I went back to the States in 2015, and I saw the copy in person and took detailed notes on it. But I was not allowed to photograph anything. The owner allowed me to have half a dozen photographs that he took himself. And in 2017, I made my translation public in a book published by Routledge. Now, what do these notes show? Well, here is Vesalius's copy of the 1538 anatomical principles. And some of the notes, like the one you can see here, are simply proof corrections. The printer had missed out several lines, as you can see at the bottom of the page. But others are more interesting. At the top of the page, right up in the left-hand margin, is a little note about the periostion. You can see the word on line 1, in which Vesalius says, this is something that was totally unknown before I found it. And throughout this book, we have little additions by Vesalius. We also have funny numbers, and you can see in the left-hand margin, numbers 89D or 58. These, I've discovered, are references to passages in Galen. And what we can see here is Vesalius moving from wanting to produce a new edition of this book to beginning to write the Fabrica and taking notes on Galen and passages he will discuss further. As I've said, in 2009, I was allowed to see this book. It's Vesalius's own copy, purchased by a local hospital doctor in a small town across the bay from Vancouver. And it's now on display in Toronto. It contains several thousand annotations. Not every page is quite as filled with notes as this. What's going on? Well, clearly Vesalius is planning a new edition. He corrects printing mistakes. He makes changes of words and so on. He's planning a third edition, which never took place, in part because his printer couldn't sell all the copies of the second. It tells us about Vesalius's reading. Here at the bottom of the page, we have the first reference in a medical text to female circumcision among the inhabitants of Ethiopia, whose religious practices, he says, are generally similar to those of other Christians. But Vesalius had never been to Ethiopia, and he simply found the information in a history book by a man called Paolo Giovio. But also, he's correcting the pictures. You can see this on your screens. It's about four times the size of what you can see on the actual printed page. And you should be able to see a thin brown ink line. And underneath, Vesalius says, this picture has been mucked up because of the incompetence of the actual block cutter. This is incredibly tiny, hard to see. It just shows something about Vesalius's hand, and indeed some of the other corrections to the plates show he has the firm hand of a surgeon. And what do these notes tell us? We have Vesalius the obsessive, wanting to get it right. He corrects himself, and he recorrects himself at times. There's Vesalius the artist, the man who can draw, and the new letter contains 2 drawings by Vesalius. He's a Galenist. He knows his Galen. Remember those funny numbers I showed you earlier. And of course, this is Vesalius the anatomist. And none of the notes to this edition, for this new edition, show new dissection material. Most of the time, Vesalius is dealing simply with bones and trying to express in words how it feels to hold a bone in your hand. And finally, who bought and read the Fabrica? What happened to it? Now, the traditional story is that most Galenists had nothing to do with Vesalius. They were very angry with him about all his comments denigrating Galen. In fact, it's more likely that they were not particularly pleased with this because they saw Vesalius as taking over chunks of Galen without acknowledgement, and that is true. And interestingly, the people who are most angry with Vesalius are those who had personal contact with him. They knew him as a man of talent and extraordinary ambition. But in 2018, this book was published, a very expensive book published by Brill, in which the editorial team have collected as much information they can find on all the copies of the Fabrica. And between them, they have really opened up the world of Vesalius. They have overthrown the idea that his writings were not followed. Here is a book published just before this period, in 2015, which shows how even in Spain, young doctors are quickly taking up Vesalian ideas. And only last couple of years ago, I came across this remarkable comment by a Cambridge BA who moved to London, a fellow of the College of Physicians, who writes a book on medicine. In 1543, it's prefaced with a long section on anatomy. In 1547, that is replaced by a very few words. Those people who want to know anatomy should read the big books of Galen and Vesalius. Whether Christopher Langton had ever seen the Fabrica, I don't know. He may not have read it, but he knew it was big and he knew it was important. And I'll end with another recent discovery. What is, I think, the first reference to Vesalius as the new Copernicus, the Copernicus of medicine. And it comes in the middle of a book of a doctor and astrologer at the imperial court of Prague, Tadeusz Hagiecius, in 1565, who says Vesalius has changed the world of anatomy fundamentally in just the same way as Copernicus has changed our view of the universe. All I'm going to say in conclusion is that discoveries over the last 10 years, indeed 11 years, have changed our view of Vesalius fundamentally, so that we have now got to go back to basics with new material, and we can be sure there is more out there to be discovered. Thank you.